And here we're returning to Fair's Fair, real quick this time though, because we're not actually talking about any particular show at this point. What we're talking about is good shows. And the fact that you don't really have to like them. Now I know that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but let me explain. First things first, we're going to have to get out of the way the obvious elephant in the room and the trusty hide-behind for every reviewer out there who ever gets a negative response to their review. What is a good or a bad show? Is it subjective? Is it really objective in any way? Now, I do believe there is a such thing as objectively poorly written. Let's get this out of the way. There are things that make a good and a bad show. For instance, a good show will have consistent characters, blah blah blah. Everyone knows what a good show is. Consistency, not breaking your own rules, not leaving plot points hanging, having an actual thing that you're moving towards instead of just milling around. But I suppose there's a fandom for that too, since, you know, slice of life is a thing. But a good show generally has its shit together. It has a story, it has an idea of what it's supposed to be doing, it has characters that follow a logical progression from one set to the next, they're important to what they're doing, they're important to where they are, and it makes sense for them to be there and for them to be involved. Obviously, if a character has no reason to be in the plot, then there's no reason to include that character. Whereas a bad show will have an inconsistent plot, it'll have characters there that don't need to be there, it'll have them say things out of context or out of their character's field of knowledge, simply because they need to force the plot along. It'll have set pieces designed exclusively to give the heroes advantages, or it will have the heroes have an absurd advantage in the first place, a threat or a problem that isn't actually a problem. A lot of things can be a problem. You could have entire set pieces completely forgotten in your movie, you could have characters that don't actually do anything, you could blatantly forget previous canon, you could introduce elements that don't make sense or raise more questions about whether or not there was any feasible issue in the first place, or you could have a character that simply just succeeds because they're supposed to at that particular time. You could have story points that come up out of nowhere. There's a million things you could do wrong. Or for some egregious reason, you could somehow do all of those wrong in the same movie. But, I mean, there's no way you'd do that much wrong. And there's a million more things you could do wrong in a story. Plenty of things you can do wrong, plenty of things you can do right. Now, the question is, at what point does it go from being bad to good? Well, it really matters how many of those were done wrong and how wrong they were done. There is a level of subjectivity. There's a lot of gray area in the middle. We can generally address the good and the bad on either end of the spectrum because it's really obvious where the flaws are. And then again, on the other side, it's really obvious that there aren't a lot of them. The most common argument about whether or not there is good or bad is that, well, you can't really draw a line at which point it changes from one to the other, because it's all down to subjectivism past there. But of course, that's argument of the beard, one of my favorite fallacies and a really big one out there on the internet. Just because you cannot tell someone specifically where the line is crossed and where the two ends of the spectrum meet in the middle doesn't mean that you can fully deny one side or the other. Argument of the beard. At what point does someone go from being clean-shaven to having a beard? At what point is a 5 o'clock shadow no longer stubble? Maybe it grows in patches or unevenly, you never know. At what point does it count as a beard? Because you can't draw a hard line in between that is universal across all people, the argument would be that there is no distinction and therefore no reason to count one as separate for the other, but you can clearly tell when someone doesn't have a beard and when someone does have a beard, so it's a fallacy of thought. Just because you can't draw a clean line in between and there's a lot of subjectivity about where is too much, doesn't mean that it's inherently not a thing. There is objective bad. There is objective good. Now, here's where your mind's going to be blown. There is subjectivity as to whether or not you like it. I know, right? Madness. The example of good that I'm going to be using here is, well, The Godfather. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone who could tell me that The Godfather is a terribly made movie with a straight face. It's simply not true. It's too well made. There's too much right. Everyone seems to be acting appropriately for their character. All of the story progress makes sense where it is. The pacing is very atmospheric and sets the mood quite nicely. It's an outrageously good movie. I hate it. I'm sorry, I'm not interested in gangster movies. Like, you cannot fathom just how little interest I have in old school gangster movies. And as such, this delicate pacing and big epic story bores the shit out of me. I couldn't even finish the whole series. I couldn't. I didn't like it. And that's okay. It's good. I'll admit that it's good. I know it's good. I don't like it. But that's where we get this weird group of people who can't seem to understand that. A lot of people ask you, what didn't you like about the movie after they show you their favorite movie? And, well, okay, that's kind of reasonable. They're looking for your opinion on it. And in most movies, you can just easily point it out. Be like, well, I didn't like this, or this was poorly made, or this was a deal breaker for me. It doesn't mean that the movie was bad, it just means that there were specific parts that weren't done right that bothered you. They bothered you more than they bothered the other person, because again, whether or not you like it is subjective. It doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad movie. While normally people will accept these particular points, it gets kind of gray when you just didn't like it. Even worse, in the case of The Godfather, maybe they just weren't interested in the topic at all. How do you explain that? There is no explanation. You just don't like the topic. You didn't like the genre. It wasn't your shtick. And this is an issue for a lot of people because sometimes you don't see enough wrong with the movie that you can really justify not liking it, but it's not in your genre, so you didn't really enjoy it. And this generally isn't a good answer to most people, because the idea that you just don't like the genre is something they can't inherently just understand most of the time. And this is the message to them. Sometimes people just aren't into your shtick. I'm a big fan of cyberpunk, dieselpunk, steampunk, and Lord knows movies around there are absolutely rife with issue. Like, most of them have a passing glance at a physics textbook on their way by, but some of them just straight up ritualistically sacrifice it in a pentagram to the elder gods. I hate to inform you of this, but the vast majority of all steampunk things that you see in steampunk worlds wouldn't fucking work. Like, the physics just aren't there. It makes zero sense. Cyberpunk gets away with a little bit more, but a lot of that doesn't make a huge amount of sense either sometimes. That or it ends up so far up its own ass with symbolism that they end up losing track of the actual story they were trying to tell, but, that's just how it happens to be sometimes. And like I said before, I'm a sucker for a villain. I love a good villain. Which brings us to the other point, you can like a bad movie too. Yeah, I know. Some of the cult classics out there, they were bad movies. My particular poisons of poorly made things that, I liked. First was Tremors that, was okay, pretty decent in the first one. Had a very unique monster. It was very thrillery. Had a nice amount of scare to it. I liked it. It was good. And it had such a unique villain. Now, I know what you're saying. What was wrong with Tremors? Well, nothing. The first Tremors was fine. Tremors 2 was okay. Tremors 3 kinda was showing its age and not really doing so good. And Tremors 4, well, they kind of got back up there because, they decided to go back in time and re-simplify the whole project. None of this overcomplicated life cycle shit. Big underground monster shits. Trying to deal with this with weapons inherently not designed to deal with things underground. Nice and simple. Then 5, 6, and 7, I don't, I don't know where they are. They're somewhere in the basement. I'll have to go look for them later. But it got bad, and God curse me, banish me down into the many rings of hellfire and destruction for my great sin. I still watched them all. I couldn't help it. I knew 7 wasn't gonna be good, but I enjoyed all the others because they were still part of that classic thing that I like. A small part of me even said, well, hey, 7 seems to be doing slightly better than the others did. That's not a point in its favor. It could hardly do worse than 5 and 6. In addition to that, I also like Stargate SG-1. Absolute cult classic. Amazing. Big. Epic. All kinds of story. And they had the damnedest time maintaining continuity with the rules of the single alien artifact around which they based their entire fucking series. Like, seriously, the rules of the Stargate seem to be relatively wishy-washy. Well, it can travel you back in time if you loop around to the same one around the fucking sun somehow, because looping around the sun controls time. I guess Star Trek did it, so we'll just pretend that's how things work now. But what do you mean? It had like an echo from the future in the past that fucking let the Stargate be there? You just straight up Deus Ex Machina made up an entire rule of physics just so you could allow this scene to happen? Why couldn't you just admit that you couldn't think of a good way to send them back in time? Or better yet, not fuck with time travel. Pro tip, if you're doing anything sci-fi, don't fuck with time travel. It will always fuck you back. Every single time. Not to mention, apparently you can also loop around back to yourself to go to another reality. To do a thing and get multiple people colliding in the same reality to do... Wait, what? Why didn't you just use the... Why didn't you just use the alternate reality mirror? You already had an alien artifact that traversed between realities. Why would you use the Stargate for this? Did you accidentally write yourself into a corner? Also, you know, they had a Deus Ex Machina element that was just shy of vibranium levels of convenient. Only it was Naquadah here. Still a little bit ridiculous. It absorbs energy like a battery. It's practically a power converter. Also, it can store energy. Also, it can turn into a volatile state with radiation. Also, it's a super explosive. And also, it cures cancer, gives you superpowers, and probably helped Lassie get little Timmy out of the well. So you see, there's a lot wrong with these, and frankly, I think on a lot of old school cult classic sci-fi, I could call them bad series because they just don't know how any of the science works. No matter how much people like to defend that they totally did. So it might seem weird to say, and it might not be something you want to accept, but your particular medium of choice of whatever good story you have, be it the Lord of the Rings books, not as much the movies, but the books for sure, The Godfather, or other well-written series, or books, or movies, whatever. Just because it's good doesn't mean someone has to like it. If someone says they don't like a particular genre because it's just not their interest, or this one didn't play that genre in a way they found interesting, that's okay. Let people not enjoy something even if it's good. Also, let them enjoy it even if it's bad. Because a guilty pleasure every now and then is totally deserved. So instead of being entertainingly angry down in the comments, since I don't think I've said anything here that could really make someone really angry, how about we all tell everyone about our guilty pleasures? Those books, those manga, those comics, those movies, those series, those video games, the ones with the shit plot, shit development, terrible characters, or just nonsense lack of understanding of how humans interact. Let me know, what's your guilty pleasure, and what's a well-made movie that you just didn't like?